Hey guys, in this video we are going to talk about accessors and mutators in Laravel. And it sounds kind of weird, accessors and mutators sounds kind of complicated, but it's actually very simple. An accessor is getting data from the database and changing it as you get it from the database, and a mutator is putting data into the database and changing it before it gets put into the database. So in this quick video we'll show you an example of how to use accessors and mutators. Okay, so getting started, I have a blank Laravel application inside of my site's accessors mutators folder. So I'm going to run php artisan serve, and I have a server up on localhost 8000. So if I go to localhost 8000, then sure enough I have a Laravel 5 blank installation. And what I have done is I've run the user migrations. So I have a users table, and if I go to my database, I can see that I have a users table with no users in there, passwords and migrations, but all we're going to pay attention to is this users table. So I also did add two routes to my application. I added a route called create, and what this does is it creates a John Doe user. So the name of John Doe, email is johndoe@gmail.com, and password is just password. So if I go to this route, it is going to create this dummy user for me. So let's go to localhost 8000/create. And if I have a look in my database, I refresh, you can see that we have John Doe at johndoe@gmail.com. So we have a sample user in our database. And I've also created this other route that prints out the user's name and email who has an ID of 1. So John Doe has an ID of 1. We are going to print out his information on the screen. So let's go to localhost 8000/user. And we have John Doe, and we have johndoe@gmail.com. Now let's say that we wanted to capitalize the first and last name of every user that we get from the database. Yeah, we could always, inside of our view, do a UC words and just make sure that each of these are capitalized. But why would we want to do that in every single view? Why can't we just say whenever we get this name from the database, why don't we just capitalize the first and last name? So that's exactly what an accessor is. So let's go ahead and create our first accessor. So if I go to my app and user model, because we are using the user table, I can create a new function in here. And this function I will call get name attribute. And this is the way that all of your accessors will look. It will be camel cased, and you will say get, and then it will be the row, the name of the row, and then attribute. So in our case, we want the name row, so we say get name attribute. If we wanted to change the email address, we would say public function get email attribute. And then we pass the value, because the value is going to be whatever we are getting back originally from the database. So I'm going to comment out this get email attribute, and I'm going to return, I'll say UC words, because this is going to capitalize every single word. It's just a simple PHP function, and I'll say value. So if I save that and I refresh the page, you can see now that John Doe is capitalized. So anywhere in our application that we say, hey, get the name, it is always going to guarantee that the first and last name are capitalized, which is great because we don't want to have to do it in every single view. So the next thing that we may want to do is, let's say the email address, we want to lowercase every single email address. And I'm actually going to have to look up PHP to lower. Let me see, what is that function? String to lowercase, str to lower. Okay, so I will uncomment this get email attribute, and I'll say return str to lower value. So I will save that, refresh my page, and now you can see that any email address that we get back, it is always going to be lowercase. And sometimes people put in their email address and it could be not formatted correctly, but now we can guarantee every single time that we get an email address, it's always going to be lowercase. So that is the very basics of accessors, simply getting data from the database and making sure that it's formatted correctly. We alternatively have mutators, which changes the data before it gets put into the database. So let's go ahead and show you a quick example of using a mutator. So let's say that we want to change the name before it gets put into the database, and we just want to capitalize it every time we put it into the database. So we will say public function set name attribute. We will pass the value. And here we are going to say this attributes name equals, and then we will say UC words $value. So this is going to basically say that when we set the name attribute in the database, we want to make sure that that name has capital letters for the first and last name, or any word that is put into the name row, we want that to be capitalized. So let's go ahead and create our mutator for our email address. So we'll say public function set email attribute, and it will be the same thing. So we will say this attributes, we'll say email equals str to lower value. So now let's go back to our routes and let's create another user. So let's say that we have Frank Jones. So his email will be frankjones@gmail.com. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's go to our create route, and this will create that new user. Okay, now let's check out our database. Okay, and as you can see inside of our database, and it looks like I put Frank Joan instead of Frank Jones, but we have the first and last name are both capitalized, and the email address is lowercase. So it's great because we changed the value before we put the name and the email address into the database. So that is the very basics of mutators. You can change the way that you put data into the database before it actually gets put in, and accessors, you can change data the way that it returns back to you. And that's the very basics of using accessors and mutators. It's a very simple concept, but I think it scares a lot of people away by the name accessors and mutators. A little frightening, but it's a very simple concept. I'm going to continue to use it in all of my future apps, and I would encourage that you do the same.